Hello, Dayspring class. It's been chaotic during the past few weeks, to say the least. We haven't been able to meet at church, and we're not sure when we can meet at church again. Hopefully, it will not be much longer. But until that time, Carl and I felt it would be good to keep in contact with some Bible study for our class. As a result, we're going to pick up where we left off in Romans chapter 9. If you remember in Romans chapter 9, Paul talks about the Jews' relationship with God. The Jews were God's chosen people. And as a result, they felt that if they obeyed the law, they were okay. They were part of God's chosen elect. They would go to heaven. And yet, as Paul studied the scriptures, as he had his relationship with Jesus Christ, he knew that something more was needed, a relationship with Jesus Christ. I think this is important for us today as well, because there's a lot of Christians who basically believe that faith in Jesus isn't necessary. You can believe whatever you want to believe, as long as you're a good person. Listen to what a pastor of a 10,000 member church in New York City recently said. The belief that anyone who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ is going to hell is insanity. People take many paths to God, even if that path does not involve faith in Jesus Christ. You see what he's saying? You do not need Jesus Christ in order to get to heaven. You can believe whatever you want to believe. And there's a lot of Christians who believe this as well. In 2008, a Pew Research Center study found that more than half of all American Christians believe that at least some non-Christian faiths can lead to salvation. That means Jews, Hindus, Islamic, Buddhist. Anyone can get to heaven. But is that true? It might be politically correct, but is it biblically correct? There's some key questions we have to ask ourselves. Why were the apostles and other early Christian leaders so eager to spread the gospel, not only to the Gentiles, but to the Jews? And why send missionaries to other people who believed in their own gods, if there were many different ways to get to heaven? Paul was a devoted Jew. If anyone could have gone into heaven by obedience to the law, it was Paul. And yet Paul felt that he needed something more, a relationship with Jesus Christ. And not only for himself, he felt all Jews needed a relationship with Jesus Christ. Notice when he would go to cities to preach the gospel, he always started among the Jews. He went to the synagogue. It was only after the Jews rejected him that he went to the Gentiles in these cities. He was a missionary to both the Jews and the Gentiles. And maybe the most important question of all, if there are many ways to salvation, then why did Jesus die on the cross? Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed, "Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me." In other words, if there's other ways to accomplish salvation, then I don't have to die. But there was no other way. And Jesus concluded, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." So that brings us to Romans chapter 9, that Paul talks about the Jewish rejection of Jesus Christ. And he does it with sorrow in his heart. Because the Jews rejected Jesus, they were not going to be saved. And then he talks about what makes a true Jew. Yes, God made his promise to the Jewish nation. But because some of the Jews rejected him, in fact, probably most of the Jews rejected Jesus, that meant they weren't going to be saved. And Paul asks a question, does this mean God failed? And his answer is no. Because not everyone who is a descendant of Abraham is a true Jew. And we see the example of both Ishmael and Esau. Ishmael was a son of Abraham, just as Isaac was. But God's promise went through Isaac and not Ishmael. Likewise, Esau and Jacob were twin brothers. But the promise went through Jacob and not Esau. So that leads us to verse 11. And let's pick up with verse 10 and read verses 10 and 11. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by the father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by works by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, just as is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. I wanted to pick up on the term election. That's an important word and a very interesting word. What does it mean to be part of God's elect? The Jewish people were very familiar with this because they felt they were the elect. They were God's chosen people. There's an old rhyme that describes it well. How odd of God to choose the Jews. Out of all the nations on the earth, God chose the Jews. That's election. Not because they were better or bigger or stronger, but because God chose them. Out of his free will, he chose them, just as he chose Jacob over Esau and Isaac over Ishmael. The doctrine of election teaches that it's God's sovereign choice to save us by his goodness and mercy, and not by our own merit and our own accomplishments. But does this mean that God chooses who are saved and then chooses to reject others? That's not a new concept to the Jews, but it is a strange concept for us. And next week, we're going to look at this in more detail. What does it mean to be part of God's elect? And we're going to do it by comparing a little bit of John Calvin's belief with those of Jacob Arminius. I remember with the first church I served, there was a free church about 30 miles away. And one day, one of the members of the free church was talking to me, and they posed a question. Are you a Calvinist or are you an Arminianist? And I wasn't quite sure what they meant. But they're talking about this matter of election. And we're going to get into that next week.